This happened to me about 5 years ago. At that time, I had a lot of crazy ideas about life and wasn't afraid to say them. This behavior put me in conflict with most people, especially those closest to me. Like my parents, we would butt heads at least twice a week. It was usually my fault. I wasn't just a loud idiot, but I was also a slob. Don't get me wrong, I bathed religiously and had overall great hygiene. I fell short when it came to picking up. Whenever I would buy something, I usually wadded up the receipt and chucked it on the floor. Just sloppy stuff like that. I didn't realize how fast that stuff added up. Before I knew it, I couldn't see my floor, and to be honest, I didn't really care. Anyway, one day I said something very disrespectful to my folks, and my mom slapped me. She'd never touched me before, so I was a bit shocked. Instead of apologizing, I called her something I regretted, and this set my dad off. Some more words were exchanged, and he told me to get out. In my deluded brain, I thought this was no big deal. I'd crash my car until I had enough to get my own place. Then I'd never have to deal with their rules again. I had no clue how hard this was going to be. I grabbed my laptop and took off in my junky 1992 Civic. I worked that night as usual. Afterward, I laid down the back seat and tried to go to sleep. The parking lot lights made it hard, but I eventually managed to doze off. Around midnight, a banging woke me up. It was a cop. I told him the situation, but he said I had to move on regardless. I moved on to the next place, and the same thing happened. For the rest of the night, I hopped from place to place, being told to move on every time. Needless to say, I got very little sleep, and finally around 6 a.m. I caught a few hours in the Walmart parking lot. Later that day, I went inside the store and bought a few things, including a cheap sleeping bag and blanket. I noticed I was starting to get a tad smelly, so I cleaned up in the bathroom sink. The cracks in my theory were already beginning to show. Even after my bath and a liberal application of deodorant, I still felt dirty. I took another nap until I had to go to work. I was worried my whole shift someone would notice that I was wearing the same clothes as the day before. If they did, no one said anything. I headed straight for Walmart afterwards. This time I parked my car away from the lights, and I was much more comfortable now and quickly fell asleep. Sometime in the night, a noise outside woke me up. I assumed it was a cop, and when I stuck my head up, instead I saw a person rummaging through my glove box. He must not have seen me laying in the back. I was half asleep and more curious than scared, as I should have been. I sat up and asked him what he was doing. And this must have scared him. He jumped up, out of the car, and peeked down into the back. When he saw me, his eyes got real big. He pulled out a knife and began leaning into the car. By now, I was squeezed between the seats. When I saw the knife, I grabbed the door and attempted to shut it. He got his knife-wielding arm in the door and tried pulling it open with the other. I was fighting against it, pulling the door with both hands. This seemed to go on forever. I was about to lose my grip when I saw a flash to my left. All of a sudden, the guy yanked his arm out and the door slammed shut. I didn't realize what was happening until I noticed a second man standing outside and saw the knife guy running in the distance. The second man walked up to my passenger side window and asked if I was okay. I assumed I was safe now and stepped out. I thanked him for chasing the man off. He explained he had been gassing up his car and heard the struggle. He turned around and saw the knife flashing through my windshield. The guy must have spooked and ran when he saw him coming. He asked what had caused the fight, and I explained that it was an attempted robbery. I had scared the guy and he pulled a knife. Then I explained my situation. He turned out to be very sympathetic. He'd said he'd been homeless a while after he left the army. What he did next, I'll forever be grateful for. He offered his driveway to me. We were strangers, obviously. He didn't know me from Adam, but he believed every man deserved a safe place to sleep. During the day, I was on my own. However, after work, I'd be allowed to park at his home. That way, I wouldn't be harassed by cops or worry about being robbed. I thanked him, yet again, and almost began crying. He introduced himself as Nathaniel. We shook hands and I followed him home. That night I slept better than I had in a few days. I drove around that morning and thought about how terrible my life of freedom had been, and I was on the road to enlightenment, but it would take a few more days to reach my destination. I'd repeat the same pattern day after day. Wake up and take a shower with Nathaniel's water hose, drive up to get breakfast, hang out at Starbucks for the free internet until work, go to work, and then drive back to Nathaniel's to sleep. Not until the fourth day did I go inside his house, and I never asked before then. Neither of us knew the other, and I didn't blame him for his caution toward me. That fourth morning was a Saturday. About 7 a.m., Nathaniel knocked on my window and invited me in to have breakfast with his family. I was a bit nervous to meet them. He introduced them to me, one by one. They were all very nice. We made small talk, and when we'd finished, his wife said I could take a shower. I almost broke down right there. This woman had never met me until this morning and was treating me like a son. She reminded me of my mom, actually. I was beginning to see how much I'd taken my family for granted. After my shower, Nathaniel and his wife invited me to sit down and talk, and I was scared of what they'd say. I shouldn't have been. We just talked about my situation, and they asked what I had planned, moving ahead. I wasn't sure, honestly. Nathaniel did give me a great piece of advice. He asked if I thought my relationship with my parents was salvageable, and I figured it still was. He recommended I patch things up with them. He said he'd had a rocky history with his father. He'd always intended to reconcile with him, but he died before that could happen. He says he wishes every day that he didn't wait. Even if I decided I didn't want to go back home, I should at least tell them that I was sorry. I thanked them for the advice and all their hospitality. And later, as I sat there at Starbucks, I thought a lot about how I'd treated my folks. It wasn't until that morning that I realized how lucky I truly was, and I decided I wanted to go home. Not so much for comfort's sake, but more so my parents would know that I was safe. At least, that's what I told myself. That evening, I called them. My mother answered. I made sure to apologize right away. I told her all that I'd learned over the last week, and I didn't mention the knife thing. I didn't want to scare her. Then I asked to speak to my father. I apologized to him also and said most of what I told my mother. Only then did I ask if I could return home, and then he said, "Of course you can. You're my son, and we love you." I broke down right then. I thanked him for being such a great father, and I said that I was on my way. I learned a lot in that week away from home. In my hometown, there exists a neighborhood of old houses caught in a limbo between opulence and poverty. For several blocks in the eastern section of town, some of the finest homes ever built stand as a reminder of a better time. Better not only in the history of the neighborhood, but the city itself. From 1905, when the first home was built, until the late 1970s, the neighborhood was the most affluent in the state. Alas, as the century drew to a close, it slowly became encircled by hordes of the less fortunate. People some may call the dregs of society. Although most are actually hardworking human beings, living paycheck to paycheck, their amoral neighbors often overshadow them with their repeated criminal acts. As so often happens, many of those who called the neighborhood home for most, if not all, of their lives fled to safer parts of the city. Despite this, there still exists a few families determined not to let their historic area fall to the barbarians at their gates, so to speak. And this is where I become a small part of this much larger story. I attended an arts magnet high school near the center of the city. My senior year, I met and fell head over heels for a girl about a year behind me. Her piercing blue eyes and dark black hair melted my icy heart instantly. We dated exclusively for the next 2 years until I transferred to a university out of state. Her and I had been together around 4 months when I was invited to a party at her house. It was a July the 4th BBQ her family held every year. When she told me where they lived, I got a little intimidated. The house just so happened to be one of the most historically important in the neighborhood. I was afraid her parents wouldn't like me because of my background. This turned out to be a foolish concern on my part. They were actually a very nice pair of people and treated me like one of their own. Upon my arrival at the house, I realized the photos didn't do it justice. It was far larger than any home I'd ever been in, and the architecture was breathtaking. My girlfriend showed me around, then led me through to the backyard. The barbecue had just begun, and the smell was heavenly. While I waited for the food, I met almost everyone. I'd estimate that there were around 100 people in attendance. Everyone I met that day treated me as a social equal. My nervousness soon faded, and I had a good time, at least until the festivities were rudely cut short. I was making my way to get another soda when I heard a loud argument. It took a second to find the location. I noticed everyone was looking at the back wall. Only then did I realize the voices were coming from the alley running behind it. The guests tried to ignore the yelling and continued talking amongst themselves. I admit my curiosity got the best of me. I moved as nonchalantly as I could toward the wall. I could tell both voices belonged to men, and one sounded very intoxicated. The longer it went on, the louder and lewder the talking got. I could see by their expressions the hosts were getting uncomfortable. My girlfriend joined me and apologized for the ruckus. Just then, a loud bang, quickly followed by two more, exploded from the alley. Most everyone instinctively crouched down. I took my girlfriend by the arm and followed the others into the house. A few of the older ladies were a little shaken up. Their husbands did their best to calm them down while we waited for police to arrive. I couldn't believe something like this was happening in such a nice neighborhood. I overheard the others talking, and they sounded the same. I must commend the police for arriving quickly. They asked their questions and allowed us to leave not long after. Despite my shock, I was eager to know exactly what had happened. After leaving the house, I circled around toward the alley. I pulled over and watched the police do their work. One sheet in the shape of a person laid stretched on the ground. Tape was blocking both ends of the alley. Nothing was clear from my position, so I left after 15 minutes. I continued south on the same road and passed through an area I'd never experienced. As far as the eye could see, the businesses, mainly pawn shops and liquor stores, had iron bars covering every bit of exposed glass. A man staggered down the street arguing with an invisible adversary. A little further on, a woman wearing a very short skirt leaned inside a car and talked to the driver. I could only assume that she was a lady of the night, as standing 2 blocks over were 2 other scantily clad women. The shooting made much more sense now. I'd grown up in a blue-collar neighborhood. I was aware of bad stuff happening, but social decadence on this level and out in the open was something I'd only seen in movies. It existing so close to a world of affluence and beauty turned everything upside down. It was the most literal example of have and have-nots I'd ever witnessed. I wouldn't have to wait long to hear what happened. That night, on the 10 o'clock news, a report gave all the salient facts. The shooting apparently spawned from an argument over drugs. One man, a homeless addict, felt that he had been cheated by the other. When the homeless man confronted the drug dealer, a heated argument broke out. Said argument ended with the death of the homeless man. The dealer fled soon after the shooting and was still at large at the time of the story. I couldn't help but feel sorry for the dead man, drug addict or not. Fortunately, the shooter was caught and later convicted, and from what I've heard, the violent crime rate has only grown since then. Everyone in the area, rich or poor, seems to be suffering. Unfortunately, in things such as this, it seems everyone loses. I'd barely had a job a week when I met Wallace. I think I'd seen him around town before, although I'm not sure. The homeless are not my primary concern when I'm busy doing errands. He seemed like a nice guy, more of a gentleman than I'd expected from someone in his position. I did my best to treat him with respect. He was still a human after all, and our initial problems stemmed from his hygiene. His breath was overpowering, and his overall smell sometimes made me gag. 5 days out of the week I saw him. I kept my distance and talked to a minimum. We got along as well as I did with any of the other regulars. I hadn't noticed his growing infatuation with me at the time. I'd never been the type to make eye contact. Perhaps I would have caught on if I was. How he got the crazy idea that I was interested in him, I can't possibly fathom. I was a 23-year-old girl, and he was at least 50. Even if he didn't smell like a garbage can, he and I would never have been involved. It couldn't have been more than a month before the flirting began. It was tame at first, but as time passed, he grew far bolder. I can't remember one time that I encouraged him. Maybe I laughed at something he said, and he took this as a sign of approval. I'll probably never know. Regardless, the flirting got so bad I had to scold him, and he didn't take this very well. The following Monday, another employee told me that he had said that I was leading him on. I laughed it off at the time, but was secretly kind of worried. That afternoon, he didn't have much to say. I was fine with this and hoped things would return to normal. However, after a few days, the sickening smile and flirting would return. The day he touched me was the final straw. I yelled at him and he bolted from the store. My manager, who was already well aware of the situation, ran out of her office. I explained that Wallace had attempted to put his arm around me. My skin still crawls every time I think about it. After that, he was banned from the store where I was working. It felt like a massive weight had been lifted from my shoulders. Now, I realize how naive it must have been to think the problem was over. It would actually become far worse. I wouldn't see Wallace in the store after that. It appeared that he was following the rules. Another week went by before I noticed him walking up and down the sidewalk directly across the street. I initially got worried, but after a while he disappeared and I figured I was overreacting. I went on with work and didn't see him for the rest of my shift. That night, as I locked up, I looked around, but he was nowhere to be seen. The short walk to my apartment went on as usual. A few people milled around, but the area was quiet. Once I was inside, I took a shower and dropped down on the couch. I resumed the show that I was watching and must have fallen asleep. A noise from outside woke me up a little later. It sounded like a man yelling. I sleepily stumbled to the window and peeked out. It was the worst thing I could have done. Down below stood Wallace. He was staggering around, yelling my name. When I opened the curtain, he looked right at me. I tried closing it, but it was too late. Now he knew where I lived. He began laughing and walking up the stairs. As he got closer, I could tell that he was very drunk. I'd never seen him like that before. His words chilled me to the bone. He said that he was tired of my games. He was going to teach me a lesson, whether I wanted it or not. There was no doubt what he intended to do now. I ran for my phone and dialed 911. The operator asked me the usual stuff. I told her a man had followed me home, and I was almost positive he intended to force himself on me. She told me officers were on their way. A loud bang came from behind me. Wallace must have been inside my apartment now. The banging happened again. I realized he was beating on my window. His words, despite being slurred, now had me in a near panic. His voice had an unbelievable tinge of evil to it. He began banging harder and harder on the window. I was afraid that it would break any second. I was in full panic mode now. I heard a woman screaming and realized it was me. I must have been ranting at the operator. She was doing her best to calm me, but the pounding combined with his disgusting words had driven me over the edge. Suddenly, the pounding stopped. I turned toward the window, believing it to have burst. It was still intact. A struggle had replaced the pounding. I dared to look out. Just outside my door, on the landing, 3 police officers were fighting to get Wallace under control. He was lashing and cursing at them, battling to get free. I was terrified he was going to get away and almost screamed as I watched. One of the officers finally shot him with his taser. Only then were the other 2 able to get him under control. They slapped handcuffs on him and drug him away to the patrol car, and I almost broke into tears. The relief I felt was unimaginable. One officer stayed behind. He knocked on the door and assured me that they had Wallace in custody. I opened the door and welcomed him in. I felt bad for him. He had a cut on his forehead from the struggle, and I asked if he was okay, but he shrugged it off. We were soon joined by a female officer. We sat down and I explained the whole rotten road that had led to this. I looked down at my hands and I noticed that I was uncontrollably shaking. I quickly sat on them so the officers wouldn't see. A paramedic arrived a few minutes later and asked if I needed him. I didn't, of course, and told him no. He treated the officer's cut while I spoke to them. I tried to relax after they left, but my heart continued pounding until dawn. Although I didn't get much sleep that night, I still went into work that evening. My manager tried to send me home after I told her, but I refused. She stayed with me until close, I guess to watch over me. She gave me a ride to home afterward. I do appreciate her concern. We still speak to each other on occasion, and it's been nearly 10 years, and she still treats me like a mother. She attended the trial every day with me. Her testimony did a lot to ensure Wallace's conviction. I think my situation scared her a little. She could have easily been the focus of his madness instead of me. I've since moved away from the city in which this took place. I'm not sure what had become of Wallace. Honestly, I hope he's turned his life around. When sober, he could be a good man. It only goes to show you how bad your life can become if you let alcohol take control. In Wallace's case, it not only took everything he had, it almost took everything from me, too. It's had to have almost been 20 years since this happened. I've had a severe head injury in between now and then, so it kind of can't remember a few of the smaller details. Nonetheless, the major points of that night will always stay with me. At the time, I worked for a local paper as a route courier. I was the guy who stocked the machines and provided papers to grocery stores. Nothing was different about that night as far as I can recall. I'd hit my first set of machines and was dropping off papers at the stores. I'd usually shoot the breeze with a few overnight cashiers at Kroger's for around an hour. He'd take his break and we'd smoke a bowl or three in my car. Kroger would normally mark the halfway point of my night. After leaving there, I'd cross over to the eastern side of town to my other set of machines. I was headed that way when I happened to notice them. Off to my right, maybe 30 yards away, I caught sight of 3 men running toward an alley. The closer I got, the easier it was to suss out what was happening. In actuality, 2 men were chasing another man. I have no clue why he ran into the alley, but he did. He slowed to turn the corner, and they caught up with him. One man, the bigger of the 2, punched the victim in the back of his head. The victim fell, and his attackers began kicking him. I didn't know the reason behind the fight, but I didn't like the odds. I pulled into a nearby gas station and ran toward the alley. When I was within 20 yards, I yelled at the pair to stop kicking the man. They'd made their point. They ignored me and continued kicking. I drew my pistol and fired into the air. I began carrying it soon after getting the job because I was handling a large amount of change from the machines, and I didn't have a permit to carry, but my feeling of safety outweighed any legal issues for me at the time. They looked up with their first shot. When I fired a second, they ran off and out of sight. The man laid still on the ground. I ran up to him and checked his pulse. He was still alive, but blood was coming out of his nose and ears. I knew that couldn't be good. I carefully rolled him over onto his back, and that's when I first noticed who he was. He was a homeless man that I'd often saw while working my route. I'd even spoken to him a time or two. I've slipped a 5 into his pocket once so he could get some food. He never asked for it, and that's probably why I gave it to him. At this moment, who he was wasn't important, and he needed help, and he needed it soon. I ran back over to the gas station and called 911. The ambulance arrived first. I led them over to him, and they went right to work. The cops showed a minute later, but from the start, they didn't look happy. I told them what I'd seen and the directions the attackers had fled. I left out the gun part, of course. Once the cops said something like they had done the old guy a favor, I didn't find it funny, and I told him so. The second cop spoke up and seemed a little kinder. After they took my name and other info, they said that they'd give me a call if they needed me. The paramedics loaded the man quickly into the ambulance and sped away. The officers returned to their car without even a thank you. They pulled away, took the first left, and disappeared into the night. I was left standing alone in a parking lot at 3 a.m. The entire intersection with the emergency services only lasted 10 minutes max. I was a little confused. While I appreciated their quick reaction, I got the impression no one cared about the victim, especially the first officer. You can probably guess that I never heard from the police. I even called the hospital to find out the victim's fate, but they wouldn't tell me. I didn't see him around after that, so I assumed that he may have passed. The entire episode gave me a dim view of mankind. Although I'll never change the way I treat my fellow man, I'll never expect the same show of kindness from anyone else ever again. Way back before I was married, I volunteered at several homeless shelters in California. I'd always intended to go back once our kids started school. Well, you know how life gets away from us. I wouldn't be able to return to volunteering until both our children moved away for college. I don't regret making my kids my focus all those years, but nevertheless, once I had the time to myself, I felt the call to help very strongly. Our town didn't have any full-blown shelters. I did some research and found a position at one of the community kitchens. These organizations offer a hot meal for anyone who needs it, facilities to shower, even provide connections to programs that help them get off the streets. I'm proud to tell everyone I meet that I'm part of it. Unfortunately, even in a place full of so much hope, terrible things can happen. It was 2017, and I'd been with the kitchen almost 2 years. In that time, thousands of faces passed in and out of those doors. Not until I met Hollis had I formed any close relationships with our clients. This wasn't what you may think. We were not engaged in any physical relationship of any type. I saw him as almost a father, and I believed he viewed me like a daughter. Hollis wasn't an alcoholic or addict like many of his fellow homeless. He had fought in Vietnam. Upon returning stateside, he had a difficult time readjusting. Since he was unable to hold down any real employment, he soon ended up on the streets. He'd been on and off of them multiple times over the years. He had once lived with a daughter for a short time, but they became estranged. I didn't ask what had caused the rift, but it did appear to sadden him any time it came up. I tried to convince him to call her a few times, but after he refused the last time, I didn't push the matter. In the end, it wasn't my business anyway. I was just there to help, and if the person doesn't want it, there's not a thing you can do. Among the other regulars I saw on a daily basis, Barney was perhaps one of the worst. He was everything Hollis wasn't. I don't think there was an instance in which I spoke to him when his breath didn't reek of booze. He tried to bully the other clients, and several of the women told me that he tried to force himself upon them. I didn't like the man, but I did all I could to help him, just as I would any of the other visitors. He'd sometimes tried to kiss up to me, often flashing his toothless grin and telling me how pretty I was looking that day. I ignored his behavior. I just assumed he was doing it to get something. I wouldn't find out until later that his motivations came from a much baser place. September 25th, 2017 was a day just like any other. The morning had seen a brisk turnout, and we expected the same for dinner. I was cleaning up in the dining room when Hollis came in. We had a brief conversation, and I gave him a short hug before he left. It was something I'd done countless times. I returned to the kitchen and began prepping for that evening. About an hour passed, and I heard screaming coming from the activity room. Roman, our head cook, volunteered to check it out. I stayed behind at his behest, and no more than a minute later, he ran back to the kitchen. He was short of breath and acting panic. As soon as he could speak, he said Hollis had been stabbed. and was dead. I didn't believe him and ran out to see for myself. On the floor laid Hollis with a pool of blood surrounding him. A couple of women were crying nearby, and most everyone was staring with shocked faces. He wasn't moving, and only then could I accept the truth. I collapsed at his feet, joining the others in weeping. The paramedics arrived within a few minutes and whisked him away. We all knew that there was nothing they could do. Only then did I ask who had done it. More than one witness pointed at Barney. I looked around for him, but they said that he'd walked out after the stabbing. I'd always known he was a bully, but I'd never known him to be violent. When I asked for the reason, no one answered me at first. They all had guilty looks on their faces. I then demanded they tell me. Finally, one of the women nearby said, "Well, ma'am, Mr. Wallace came into the room and Barney got in his face. He said something like, 'Don't you dare touch her again, she's mine and you know it. Don't you ever lay hands on her again, I mean it.' Mr. Hollis laughed and asked Barney who he was talking about. Barney then said, 'Well, you know well who, Booker, Jeanette in the kitchen.' This made Mr. Hollis roar out in laughter. He put his hand on Barney's shoulder and said, 'You're a riot, Bates.' Then he laughed even louder. And this made Barney furious. He pulled a knife out from his pocket and stabbed Mr. Hollis. Mr. Hollis dropped dead where he stood, and Barney turned around and walked out, calmly. I was speechless. No idea what to say. Barney never gave me a reason to believe he was obsessed with me, certainly not enough to kill. I sat down and began bawling again, my hands over my face in shame. The idea of being the cause of Hollis's death was horrifying. It seemed like hours before I could get it together. By then, words were filtering in that Hollis had been pronounced dead upon arrival at the hospital. It wasn't a shock. Once the police decided I was free to leave, one of the other volunteers drove me home. I was still a mess and useless to the kitchen. Even as late as bedtime that evening, I cried myself to sleep in my husband's arms. I took a few days off to decide if I was continuing at the kitchen. During that period, I was happy to hear Barney had been arrested. I've heard he told the police it was self-defense, but I know for a fact Hollis didn't have a mean bone in his body. Doing it in front of a room full of people didn't help his case either. He wisely took the sentence that he was being offered and most likely will die in prison. After the funeral, I decided to return to my job at the kitchen. I don't think Hollis would have wanted me to give up on helping people. I won't lie. It's been hard working every day without Hollis being around, knowing everyone knows the reason why. I know I would have been miserable if I hadn't. While returning to work has been difficult, forming any bonds with the clients, well, that part has been far harder. A mere 5 years ago, I discovered the existence of a silent plague sweeping the nation, an unknown wildfire roaring unhindered through our homeless population. In America, the less fortunate, those forced to live on the streets, are almost invisible to most of us. I too once looked at them with disgust, even derision, if I looked at them at all. That was until a series of events occurred that drastically altered the way in which I viewed them. In 1995, I inherited a small corner store from my father. He, along with my mother, opened it in 1962. At that time, the neighborhood was home to predominantly Catholic blue-collared folks. As I grew older, I watched the neighborhood undergo massive change. With the influx of very low-income individuals to the area, most made the move to nearby suburbs. Such a large exodus of the population naturally caused the area to financially implode. With time, even the newer arrivals would move on, leaving a gaping hole in the area's housing market. Eventually, as the 1980s came to a close, the overwhelming majority of the area had been redeveloped into industrial space and chain stores. We were the last of a dying breed, and we knew it. By the point I inherited the store, our remaining time was measured in months rather than years. Most old stores like ours usually only attract a small group of patrons. We still had our die-hard customers. These came from the last few remaining families still living in the neighborhood. They were usually the old, my parents' generation and older. The overwhelming remainder were drawn from the homeless and very poor. Low-end wines and beers made up almost 40% of our monthly sales. It was a sad way to see such a once vibrant area turn out. Despite my dislike of their lifestyle, the homeless calling the neighborhood home were keeping our doors open. A small group of these men and women would even become my friends, or at least acquaintances. Two men, Jeffrey and Franklin, were probably the ones I saw the most. Both were jolly old men who shared a love of fortified wine and dirty jokes. Every once in a while they wouldn't have any money, so I'd let them stock the cooler or sweep the floor for a bottle of Mad Dog. It seemed a better option than them possibly stealing it. Early spring of 2015, something changed. Franklin stopped coming in. He'd been coming into my store 7 days a week for as long as I could remember. I was a little concerned, but assumed he may be sick. When he didn't show for the third day in a row, I knew something had to be wrong. A few of the others, including Jeffrey, hadn't seen him either. I learned the location of a few of his haunts and decided to search each one. I finally found him at an abandoned warehouse. He slept there in the cooler months. He appeared to have been dead for several days. At least that's what the cops told me. They wouldn't know the cause for a few weeks, but judging from the puncture mark on his arm, he'd overdosed. I hadn't found a needle or anything near his body. I knew he wasn't an addict. We'd had a discussion about drugs once. He thought they were destructive. The irony of this coming from a drunk wasn't lost on me. It was a hard pill to swallow. I didn't want to accept it, but as time passed, I learned things about Franklin, things he'd lied about in the past. Despite his story of hating drugs, I'd found out he was no stranger to them. In his younger years, he'd been quite the amateur chemist. I suppose I shouldn't have been surprised. He was a homeless drunk. I chalked it up as a learning experience and moved on. After that, I took what Jeffrey and his friends told me with a pinch of salt. I wasn't angry at them. I should have known better. Life had just begun to get back to normal when another of the family disappeared. It was Jeffrey this time. Just like Franklin, I waited a few days before asking around about him. No one knew anything for about a week. Then one morning, an on-and-off-again girlfriend of his came in for a bottle. She only shopped the store on rare occasions. I took the opportunity to ask about him. Her face dropped, and she looked down. "You haven't heard?" Not knowing what she meant, I naturally said no. "He got a hold of some strong dope and OD'd on it." I shouldn't have been shocked, but I was. I knew Jeff dabbled with drugs from time to time. Quickly, however, my shock gave way to suspicion. How did two men overdose on heroin so close together? I asked her if a string of overdoses was going around. It does happen once in a while. She said no. As a matter of fact, she hadn't heard of any other than Franklin. A second overdose so close to the first, I couldn't shake my feeling of unease. The next few days I turned it over in my brain. I did my best to see it objectively. Any outsider would have no problem saying this is normal. Addicts die sometimes. It's a side effect of the habit. I looked at the deaths from every angle I could fathom. Nevertheless, something still ate at me. I began spending my time after work watching the homeless and asking them about outsiders. Technically, I was one myself, but somehow got a pass. A few names would come up in the course of my sort of investigation, I guess you could call it. None would go anywhere. They all turned out to be your run-of-the-mill do-gooders. I couldn't see any of them giving bums hotshots or the like. I continued to follow this path for around a month. I was beginning to feel stupid with my theories. They weren't the first homeless men to die from drugs, and certainly wouldn't be the last. I was 2 days away from calling it quits when 2 more men died. Like the others, both overdoses. I'd got the news from a couple of women who came into the store. Now, even the homeless themselves were beginning to sense a problem. They swore to me neither man ever touched anything more than booze. While I was skeptical of their claims, I was now fully on board with my sort of serial killer theory I had going. I wanted to go to the police, but knew I'd be rebuffed without any proof. That night, I hopped online and searched for other homeless deaths in the city. Minute after minute, the net sprawled out farther across the state, then across the country. Not every death was drug-related. In some cases, the homeless were disappearing in droves. In others, the killer was far bolder, killing them and dumping the bodies in the wide open. I had to stop after a few hours. I was overwhelmed by what I had found, whatever it was. It looked to be far worse than I could ever have dreamed of. This wasn't one psychopath drugging the homeless in one small city. It's a nationwide nightmare. Throughout our country, countless numbers of people are preying upon them. I couldn't be the only person who's connected the dots. I knew I couldn't stop it all, but I was determined to stop it in my city. I spent a week compiling every article, posting, and news report I could find. I made connections with others on the same trail I was on. I tried to get the police to listen. I made countless phone calls and personal visits to every precinct in the city. No matter how hard I tried, no one believed me. I thought perhaps the FBI would. Unfortunately, it went as much as it had with the cops. The feds said it wasn't their responsibility. After constant attempts to get law enforcement to listen, I finally gave up. I was at the end of my rope. By now, I'd had to close the store and was living off my meager Social Security checks. I thought that my options had run out until an acquaintance on Reddit put me in contact with the local reporter. A couple of months ago, we had a meeting where I showed her my evidence. She was very receptive to it. Her editor gave her the go-ahead, but insisted we have a name before publishing the story. I've been compiling a list of suspects since I initially began my journey. The recent epidemic has made things difficult. Fortunately, I've received an email from an anonymous source who may have the information I need. I hope this means I'll have that name in a few days, so keep your eyes peeled. Very soon you may see a groundbreaking story on the front page of your paper. It's something I've been looking forward to for a long time, but I know I can't rest on my laurels. Even after the story breaks, I still have loads of work to do. As I've said, this is a nationwide sickness and potentially worldwide. This name will just be the first of many, God willing, but please be patient. I'll keep you all updated. Let's hope this meeting goes well, and if so, it may mean we're truly on the road to ending this evil blight on mankind, once and for all. I'm a 31-year-old man currently living in Florida. The following story takes place when I was 17 and living in Kansas City, Missouri. I lived in Kansas City my entire life, was even born there. My childhood had been a happy one until the death of my father. His death plunged us into the depths of poverty and forced our mother to sell our home. Our new neighborhood was riddled with crime and drug addiction. This drastic change of lifestyle hit me very hard. At first, an overwhelming feeling of hopelessness enveloped me. As I got older, however, the despair transformed into a determination to break free, to escape the grinding poverty surrounding me. At 16, I began working. Most jobs were only temporary, a few weeks at most. Then, just after my 17th birthday, I got my first real job. I got on at a neighborhood grocery store as a bagger. The shifts seemed to drag on forever and pay was awful. On the upside, you were allowed tips. Too bad nobody offered them. As terrible as that job was, I have a lot of happy memories. All of the other baggers were around my age and we were constantly messing around. Probably the funniest guy was Martinez. He would always mess with the homeless that hung around the parking lot. His favorite thing was to tell a drunk guy that another homeless man had called him names or made a remark about his mother. About 60% of the time, this would cause a fight or an argument to break out. Watching two drunks try to swing at each other sure made the day go by faster. And I realized how cruel this is now, but at 17, I thought it was hilarious. This ignorant attitude would begin to change one late night just before closing. I was killing time until my shift ended. I had about 15 minutes left, and I was very slowly gathering up carts to bring inside. I remember stopping at one point to pick up a lottery ticket. I was checking to see if it was a winner when I heard loud voices off in the distance. I figured it was some drunks screaming at each other. I still had some time to kill, so I walked around to the location that I thought the voices were coming from. Sure enough, I saw two homeless men in a full-blown yelling match. The yelling lasted another minute or so until one of the guys pushed the other down. The guy got up and charged his attacker with a balled fist. I thought I had lucked out. Within 30 seconds, they were rolling around on the ground, taking occasional swings at each other. I covered my mouth so they wouldn't hear my laughing. I didn't want anything to ruin this priceless moment. One of the men finally got back to his feet and cussed out his opponent from afar. He was out of breath and could barely stand up. Things swiftly ceased being funny after this. He walked over to a chain-link fence and picked up a large bottle of some sort. Then he bent over and broke it on the ground. All he was left with was the neck and some pointy shards of glass jutting from it. My heart began pounding and a sick feeling rose up in my stomach. The other guy must have known he was in danger. He tried kicking the weapon from his hand. When this didn't work, he grabbed for the other guy's arms, and it did no good. The guy with the bottle easily pulled away and slashed his opponent's arms. When he retracted back in pain, the bottle guy stepped forward and plunged the improvised weapon into the opponent's guts. I gasped, but quickly covered my mouth to stifle it. The bottle guy stabbed the other over and over at least 5 times until his victim dropped motionless to the ground. The second the attack ended, I rushed back into the store. I said nothing. Instead, ran straight into the customer service booth and dialed 911. The last few employees hovered around me and watched as I spoke to the dispatcher. I stayed on the phone until a cop car arrived a few minutes later. I stood at the doors and waited for them to come in, but they didn't. I couldn't wait any longer and ran out to them instead. One cop seemed kind of startled, but I didn't care. I just pointed towards the scene of the attack and yelled, "Help him," and "Hurry up," at least 3 times. They just stood by their car and stared at me. My impatience caused me to make a foolish mistake. I ran off towards the scene, not taking into account whether the killer was still there. It worked, though. The cops finally got the stick out of their butts and got moving. They followed quickly behind me in the car until I stopped and pointed at the victim. Lucky for me, the killer had escaped while I was gone. The officers noticed the man and approached him. An ambulance arrived mere seconds later, and the paramedics went to work trying to save him. Meanwhile, I'm describing everything I saw as it happened and acting out the scene for the cops. I must have looked like a huge moron. Another 2 cars joined us at some point. They were parked down by the store entrance, questioning the other employees. I'm not sure how long the cops kept us at the store. I didn't make it back to the house until about 3 a.m., but I had to walk. The entire journey, I was looking all around me, hoping a crazed bum with a broken beer bottle wasn't waiting around the corner. The next morning, I told my mom and brother what had happened. My mother was terrified and tried to get me to call into work that evening. I went anyway. The minute I walked in, the other baggers were crawling all over me. They had loads of questions. I answered each one probably 10 times. My manager even pulled me aside to inquire if I was okay to work. I told her I was. Only then did she let me know that the man had died at the hospital. It shocked me, but after what I'd seen, I can't say it was unexpected. The rest of my time working there was far less action-packed. We had our occasional shopliftings, but nothing else. I never found out if the killer was caught. The cops didn't seem to even care either way. One less bum, I suppose, in their mind. It's a mindset even I was once guilty of. Maybe a time will come where all human lives have equal value. It would be an awesome thing, but considering the unrest currently tearing our country apart, I don't expect it will ever become a reality. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.